Hi, I'm Mina Malik Hussain and you're watching The Coffee Table. And you know, we like to geek out on this show. And today I'm so excited because we're finally going to be having a conversation that I've been really keen to have for a longish time now. And I'm so excited and really, really happy to be welcoming two of our brightest and best writers in Pakistan writing right now, and more importantly, translating a lot of wonderful Urdu literature into English and sort of rightfully helping us and Urdu literature take its position on the world literature arena. Joining me both over the internet from afar is my friend Bilal Tanweer, who is the author of The Scatter Here is Too Great. That was his first novel. It won the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. It was also shortlisted for the DSC and the Chautauqua Prize. More pertinently, Scatter was translated into French and German. Yay! And Bilal has received the Pen Translation Fund Grant to translate Muhammad Khalid Akhtar's book Love in Chakiwara and Other Misadventures, and currently he teaches at LUMS and is working on a second novel. My second guest today is Musharraf Farooqi, who is an author, a translator. He's the founding editor of the Urdu Thesaurus, which is, I think, this magnificent labor of love. He has also founded StoryKit, which is an interactive method of storytelling. It's great fun. It's wonderful. I've played it. It's amazing. And he has, to his great credit, translated Dastan-e Hamza. He's translated Tilism-e Hoshruba. He has translated Afzal Ahmad Sayyid's poetry. And his wonderful book, The Merman and the Book of Power, has just come out, well, recently come out, and is a delight from beginning to end, visually and to read. So welcome, gentlemen, all, to the show.
Thank you.
I'm so happy. You know, I think literature shows are my favorite shows. I'm a big fan of both of your works. So this is sort of, you know, double whammy is happening on the coffee table today. So I like to begin at the beginning, as I always say. So Musharraf, tell me, when one is a writer and a translator, the assumption is that one speaks more than one language or is able to read more than one language, correct?
That is correct, and yes. With some competency, hopefully.
But it is also true that some translators are not bilingual and then they're still translating work. And then that's a sort of different process altogether. Maybe that's something we should save for later. But tell me about your work translating Dastan-e Hamza and Tilism-e Hoshruba, because the original texts are in Farsi, yes?
They are available in a number of languages, yes, from which they have come into Urdu, starting with Persian, Arabic, and other languages. In Urdu, they have existed since at least, I mean, the written versions can be traced back to early 19th century. Yes. So that is the history. Regarding the translations themselves, these were they were very challenging for me when I first attempted it, because the whole idiom, the whole archaic words, just the logistics of it, translating, like if you have 50 words which you are not familiar with, yes, on a page, and they will be even more unfamiliar to a general reader, and then translating them, finding the equivalent words in the English language, so it does not read like a modern work, but a classic that it is, and which mimics the classical idiom in the language. So one had to look at the different models, how the Arabian Nights have been translated, how the Shahnama has been translated. And they all have their particular idiom. Urdu has its own idiom. So it was a balancing act, and I still find it very challenging to translate the classics. So, but that is what I enjoy doing in addition to my own writing. So that will continue.
So tell me, Chakiwara is so much fun. So on one level, I think it's fairly obvious why one would want to translate Khalid Akhtar's work. But what drew you to translation?
I mean, what drew me to translating Khalid Akhtar's text is the person who is in the other screen, Musharraf Ali Farooqi, actually.
Yes.
I did not know of Khalid Akhtar or his work, and Musharraf introduced me to him. And not just introduced me, but in fact encouraged me to play it. When I first read it, I enjoyed it, but I did not. I was not inclined to translate it, and I think that was for my for the reason that there are things that might work in Urdu, in an Urdu narrative, that might not work in the way we read stories in English. So, for example, just to offer you a very quick example, the title book, actually the novel, Chakiwada Mein Visal, Love in Chakiwada, has this long, extensive, I think that extends to a few chapters, a long expository kind of monologue of the person who is supposedly inscribing this entire text.
Yes.
And that entire exposition, I felt would be very boring in English. And if that's the starting point of the book, then it becomes very difficult to draw in a reader and to draw in a new reader, and to, obviously the challenge is to, this has to be published by a publisher who does not read Urdu, has no background in Urdu, and will be sold to readers who are just looking at it as a standalone text and not necessarily as a text that has some sort of a background in another language. They don't necessarily care about it. So my initial hesitation was for, things like these. But I think, I translated some part of one other excerpt from a Khalid Akhtar story, and it was published on Words Without Borders, and that was received extremely well. I got a number of letters from people, including the editors who edit Word Without Borders and other people. And that sort of encouraged me to undertake the translation. And then obviously once I finished the novel, I went back to Musharraf, and Musharraf said, look, there are other Chakiwada stories that feature the same set of characters. And perhaps you want to consider including that and making it a Chakiwada volume.
Like a sort of collected Chakiwada.
Right. It's all the Chakiwada stories, like Malgudi stories.
Yes, exactly.
So I thought, I read those and I was delighted. In fact, I thought that in terms of, the writing, some of them were better than, the novel. So I sort of, translated those as well. And I think that overall, it took very long, I think maybe 7 years or something.
Wow.
But I think the final kind of outcome was delightful, and I'm very happy with it.
It was delightful. I would agree. And I think that's one of the sort of main preoccupations of translation, is to be able to get that essence across to a reader who is not familiar with that kind of wit or that kind of that sense of humor or that sort of turn of phrase. And Musharraf, it's also one of those things, because Bilal mentioned the exposition, which is a very sort of, I think, a common trope in literatures of this side of the world, where you have this narrator who very consciously sets out and to tell you a story and sort of establish that this may or may not have happened, but in this situation many years ago, X, Y, and Z. So how do you find how does it work to translate a kind of literary device like that into a language like English, which has its own kind of really set ways of telling stories?
I think the method of telling stories has not changed greatly. For example, I'll give you the example of many of these of modern Hollywood movies where you have you show a character with a still and say record scratch. How do I get here? How did I get here? I started. So it's again the same that I'm the character and I'm at point A or point B, and let me take you back to point A, and then let's move forward to point F. So the method, how interesting a story is, that keeps the reader's interest. No matter what tricks I do to make a boring story, interesting by going back and forth or putting a frame story or removing a frame story, that will not work. The strength of our fiction, our literary, the works in Urdu and other languages is their appeal, their wide appeal. And if you look at the history of their publication in the original languages, whether it was Urdu or Punjabi or other languages, they were published in tens of thousands of copies, and they remained common. They remain a part of the public consciousness, which we have lost, fortunately. So we are constantly lamenting कि भाई बच्चों के लिए कहानी नहीं है, stuff like that. But we do have a lot of these stories, and we just need to revisit them. The adults have to know where to look for good stories, and then they'll be able to do something about it. We have tons of stories. That's not even a debate.
No, but I think that's interesting because coming from a bilingual kind of country, for better or for worse, we are a region that speaks so many different languages, and I think that it's really important to remember that these literary traditions have existed for so long and continue to exist. It's just a matter of access. And like you said, Musharraf, that a lot of times parents are like, well, there are no stories in Urdu for kids, but accessibility is clearly a problem here. And why do you think that is? Is it because we are now privileging English or English literatures over local language and local literatures?
No, I think it's a matter of distribution. It's a matter of if you travel, by these Daewoo buses or one of these many buses that are out there, you stop at the station and you'll always find small bookshops set up at the bus stops. And they are doing very good business. Their prices not too. So the price point is one thing, the distribution, the access to a reader, and some kind of their ability to access the story. If it is if they think that the story is too complex or too smart for them, they may not, go for it. But with Urdu, everybody has access to that. They can just pick up the book, see. They don't need anybody's opinion to, be guided to that book or that distribution. They can just see if it's, that they like to read, and they can. So a number of factors come together, and they privilege Urdu literature in a certain other way, in its wide distribution. English is still a very small market. We talk about it. We think that because it gets reviewed and seen in bookshops, that is the only literature. Urdu literature far outsells any category of English language.
I'm delighted, actually, and I realize the irony of talking about Urdu literature on a show where we're only talking in English, but I'm really actually delighted to hear that it is doing that well. But Bilal, do you see a kind of, is there a reverse translation method also? I don't know if reverse is the right word to use, but if we are taking Urdu literature and translating it into English, which is a more world language, what's the scene like for English literatures being translated into Urdu and kind of local languages as well? Is there an interest for that also?
Mina, I'll try and answer this. I mean, I don't know how convincingly I will be able to, but I think I want to speak to a little bit to what you asked earlier, and I think I want to just jump into that conversation a little bit. Translating something like a dastan as opposed to translating something that is more contemporary is a completely different ball game altogether. And I think one of the big differences between the two are the assumptions that underpin the narrative itself. So, for example, the assumptions about what constitutes reality and what constitutes, how the world functions are fundamentally different in a classical narrative, in a pre-modern narrative than what it is in a modern narrative like a novel. So, for example, in the hero of the Dastan, or the epic hero, like Odysseus, or Rustum in Shahnameh, they are all mature men. They all embody ideals. They are formed by a certain past. And for them, their work in the world is that they will be tested on the ideals that have formed them, and that they have to stay true to. Right? Yes. I mean, that's true for Dastan heroes. That's true for all epic heroes. Whereas a modern hero, a modern Dickensian hero, if you may. For them, they have a very, very different relationship to the past. Yes. For them, the past is a lost connection. The past is actually a burden that they have to get rid of. They are all sort of lost in the world, and their journeys are very different from that of a classical hero. So their journey is one of making a life for themselves, discovering the world anew, if you may. And so actually what gets in the way of people, of contemporary readers who read Dastan or who read the epic, or who do not find it appealing in the same way that they would a novel, is actually these more fundamental things that underpin the narrative. And I think that these are important things.
The expectation. Sorry, no, I'm just interrupting you because we have to take a very quick break, but I want to finish this thought the minute we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to the coffee table. We're talking to authors and translators Musharraf Ali Farooqi and Bilal Tanweer about their work as translators and about literature, and we're having such a wonderful conversation. Sometimes I hate breaks, but I guess you guys have to breathe also. So yes, Bilal, sorry, but let us please carry on, because we were talking about the expectation of the reader, and I think that the modern reader who is used to a certain kind of trope in the modern novel versus the reader who is used to the narrative devices of something like a Dastan are two separate things, it seems. And I think and translators have to be aware of that gap. Could you call it a gap? I wonder if that's appropriate.
I think that translators certainly, I think they become aware of all of these things as they work on these things. But I think more importantly, I think that the readers have to be educated about these differences between a modern sort of a narrative and the ideas that underpin underpin a modern narrative. So I think that what in my own experience in teaching, I teach a little bit of the Dastan as opposed to a novel, is that students, or at least the students that I've had, they kind of take the novel to be a natural way of storytelling, and they kind of take all other forms like the Dastan as some sort of an oddity or some sort of weird way of writing or telling a story.
A quaint way to do it.
Right, a quaint, a dated way. But I think that the large challenge for me in that particular, in that particular session is actually to kind of make them appreciate the sophisticatedness and the complexity of that, of these pre-modern narratives, and the kind of serious thinking that those narratives are able to do that modern narratives are unable to do. And in fact, I think what I always strive to do is actually to defamiliarize the novel, to defamiliarize modern narrative forms, and to make them see that just the modern narrative forms are just as much a product of their times as pre-modern narratives.
Quite right.
I think like there is no superior or more natural way of telling a story.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, Musharraf, your work also comes in. It's so important because, for example, Merman is a collection of qissas, and it is its own particular way of telling a story. And do you feel like your experience as a translator, how did that inform the writing of this new wonderful book of yours?
For the Merman, a lot of the texts that I incorporated or pretended to incorporate, because some are original writings, as somebody else's work, I learned about those things while translating the Dastan Amir Hamza and Talisman al-Shuba.
Okay.
So like Ajaib al-Makhluqat, the book itself was one of the books I read while translating because I wanted to look up some references. The story of the merman himself is, as I mentioned in the afterword, came out of a small snippet of information about a merman who was presented before a king in that book. So I feel that all kind of work that you do, whether it's as a translator or as a writer, reader, they all inform, all narratives intersect at some level in your consciousness, in your work. And that's how I feel about the crisscrossing streams of old and new narratives in my writing.
And I think it's really beautiful that a form such as the Dastan very openly acknowledges the conversation between texts that we always have in any kind of writing or literary practice. Of course, one text speaks to you, and we are all sort of writing, we are all connected to all of these writings, and the things that we read are naturally sort of coming out in our writing, and it's not as a sort of individualistic, sort of sprung, fully formed from the forehead kind of approach to it at all that I feel like sometimes modern literature seems to have that feeling about it.
Go back to the purpose of literature. So there were a couple of very definite purposes of literature in our culture. One is to teach, to inform, and the other is to entertain. So all kinds of narrative devices are used to delay coming to the conclusion, or to keep the reader involved, or take them into a different thing. So it's not everything is cerebral. Of course, a lot of cerebral work goes into creating the frame and creating the structure through which you're going to entertain or inform your reader. But that is not. It's not an egoistical. Let's put it this way. It's not the narrative is not a projection of your ego, as maybe some narratives are.
I think that's a really
considered.
That's a really beautiful portrait, and I think that maybe as a translator, the narrative being the star of the show is even more important, because I know that on a lot of translated works, the name of the translator isn't even on the cover. It's usually always on the inside, almost like a sort of secret thing, because I'm told by publishers that a lot of times readers don't like to know that this is translated. They feel like this is a direct experience they're having with the text, with no nobody has interceded between them and the text. But clearly that we read so much in translation, that's not the case at all. And as a translator, how much, and I think this is what I'm asking really, is about the choices that then one makes as a translator when you have this text in front of you, and now you are responsible for it, for the way that people will experience it in a completely different idiom, in a completely different language. So what are the kind of choices that you kind of find yourself making when you are engaged in translation work?
Right. I'll first briefly address this thing that publishers have about not revealing that it's a translation, springing something on the reader, and then say, oh, it's a translation. So it is publishers who do it. Good publishers never do it, because if you're not respecting the nature of the work itself, and you're not respecting your reader's intelligence, then you should not be in the publishing business. You should find some other thing to manufacture.
You're right,
as a translator, one has to go with the and you cannot say that something cannot be fully translated. Yes, structures like the ghazal, because I've translated Abdullah Masayyid's poetry, but I do not touch his ghazal because I'm unable to give it a definite sort of expression which covers all the different aspects of the meaning embedded in that.
Yes,
but if you have a clear narrative, if you have a line, for example, to translate, and you say that, oh, it is completely untranslatable and the translation is so awful because this is how it should be. I think that's also the wrong way of going about translation. It just means that you are not competent in the language you are trying to translate it into. Again, you should find something else to do. I think that a translator should be completely faithful to the text, respectful to the text, and also respectful to the reader. So if you think that you cannot translate something, a bad translation is not an excuse for the process of translation, which a lot of the time happens. So I just think that everything can be fully translated unless it has a certain unless the original text has a particular nature which lends it to multiple interpretations, and therefore you cannot pin it down to any one thing, make a good translation. So that beyond that, I think translations are fun. It's a lot of fun doing it. Even though I do my own writing, I find time for translation. I really enjoy it. I learn so much about the nature of how stories can be told from a different worldview.
Quite right.
I've learned a lot from it.
So Bilal, what do you think as a translator? Do you feel that there's a pressure on the translator? Like Musharraf said, like bilingual people who are familiar with an original text have opinions about, if it's a good translation, it's a bad translation. But what, in your opinion, are the kind of things that translators, or you were at least thinking about when you were translating Chakivara?
I think that first thing that I want to kind of state is that I don't think translations are substitutes for the original, right? I think that's a misplaced notion that informs a lot of reading of translation. So I mean, a lot of readers of translations tend to think that because they somehow understand the meaning of or have captured the essence of the original, they kind of get it, which I think is seriously problematic. And that's why I always eschew words like essence while describing the translation process. I don't think that one should attempt or even make a claim about capturing the essence of the original, because the essence or the emphasis, essence in one is another way of saying whatever is the translator emphasizing in a text. Because if the essence was captured, then there would not be any need for another translation.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I think that's one of the first things that I kind of, whenever I'm offering advice on translation, and this is something that guides my own work, that there is no essentialism to translation. Every translation is an interpretation, is constructed out of certain choices. Yes. And I think that for that particular reason, while reading or while selecting translations, it's also important to see what is the politics of the translator. So for example, I mean, I think that Musharraf's work is a great example of that. I think, his choice of translating Islam, for example, in Amir Hamza as the true faith is a very interesting choice. And perhaps, one can ask Musharraf to answer this, because I think that, while I was reading this with my students, I think that this particular choice opened up so many discussions and conversations about why this might be the case. And I think that, what I offered to them was the fact that, what we understand by Islam in this moment is not what Islam means in this particular milieu that has created this particular text.
Yes.
And so if Musharraf had kept that choice, then he would have we would have been back forming a lot of we would be projecting a lot of our own ideas on this particular text. So I think that translators with these very small choices can open up huge questions about very fundamental categories like religion and so on. So I think I've forgotten what your question was really, but perhaps you can ask Musharraf to weigh in a little bit on his choice.
We will actually have more questions about language. We're going to take a very quick break and come back in like 1 second to answer it. It's a juicy one, so stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to this excellent conversation. We're talking to authors and translators Musharraf Ali Farooqi and Bilal Tanweer about the arts, the craft, and the work and language, and my favorite things. So, Bilal, we were talking about essence and how it's problematic to say that any one person can capture the essence of any one text, and that everything ultimately is everyone is sort of contributing their version of a text, which brings me to my personal I wouldn't say pet peeve, but I would say something that I think about often, is that a lot of translators are not bilingual, or they don't speak or read the language that the literature of which they are translating. Like, for example, Don Patterson has translated Rilke, but he is not familiar with German, for example, or Robert Lowell, who did so many translations and versions of poems. So what do you think about that? Like, as a translator, how do you feel about that? Because they're using a crib and then they're just sort of making a version from another version. And is that inauthentic to do? Like,
well, I don't know if there is a correct answer to that, but I think that it's important to mention perhaps the most significant instance of what you are saying is Coleman Barks and Rumi. And Rumi is the highest selling poet in North America. Coleman Barks doesn't know a jot of Persian. And yet his versions are still and continue to be the most popular versions of Rumi. Now, is that, or should that not be allowed? Should that not be called translations? Does it do a disservice to translation? I am not sure of any of those things, to be perfectly honest. I think that what we can say without any doubt is the fact that Coleman Barks has certainly brought an enormous readership to Rumi and Persian, so because of that, other works are able to find publishers, other works in verse especially are able to find publishers in English, and I think that also readers in English. So I think that yes, one could disagree with the fact that Barks should not perhaps be doing this, or this is in some way inauthentic or a violation of the original. But I think that it might. I mean, I would be more comfortable, to be honest, if it is labeled as a translated or some sort of a version instead of a translation. Because I do think, I personally ascribe to, Latin Bible's translators' dictum, which is as free as necessary, as close as possible. And I think that that's what I try to, work with in my own translations. And again, the other thing that I would add to that is as a translator, you try to focus on the element that you think is going to help you capture most of the work. That doesn't necessarily have to do anything with the work itself, rather your own preferences and sensibilities as a translator and a writer. So, for example, in Khaled Akhtar's work, I felt because humor was so central to that book, and humor is notoriously kind of evasive. I tried to focus most on his voice and trying to capture or reconstruct a voice that works for this text in English. And I think, obviously I made compromises. Some of the sentences in the original ran on for very, very long, and, they're kind of breathless. They don't
Yes.
feel breathless in Urdu, but in English, they were not working in the way I was writing them, at least. So I decided to break them up. I decided to change. And, obviously, when you're translating between Urdu and English, the biggest obstacle is the verb and the placement of the verb.
Yeah.
In English, it's in the middle of the sentence. In Urdu, it's at the end, because in English, if you try to place it at the end, it kind of, everything begins to feel more dragged, more dragged and more kind of, it kind of slows everything down.
Yeah.
The effect, the humorous.
No, I'm sort of interrupting here because don't you think that this sort of sense of grammar, for example, comes from the fact that you are somebody who is fluent in Urdu and you kind of have that understanding of the way that language works, and also the language into the territory that you're taking it into. So, Musharraf, how do you feel about that? Because, of course, the Urdu versions of Hoshaba, for example, are very old, and I think they are a text in itself. So maybe this doesn't apply so much, but it is something that I am curious about.
I'll give you an example of this from translation, but I will first approach it as a novelist.
Yes.
Because the novels are mostly based in this in our culture.
Yes.
And the conversations that take place in those are often mostly in Urdu. Although they are written in English, the situation is described in English, the dialogue is given in English, but it is understood that this thing is happening in Urdu. Yeah. So how do you approach? So description is simple because description does not change between languages.
Yes, when the tree is a tree.
Yes, the authenticity of the delivery of a dialogue could change if you're not careful with how you are writing it in English. So even though it's English, it has to read like it's Urdu, but not broken up in not in bad English.
Yeah.
It should make perfect sense as an English sentence, but it should convey that this is not a conversation taking place on curbside in New York or London, for that matter.
Yeah.
It is a conversation that's taking place in our culture, in a particular between particular characters who are having that conversation in a very definite language.
In a way, that's like the first point of translation also, isn't it? That in one's mind, it's in one sort of it's in the vernacular in your mind, but it's being written in English, and that's the first kind of point of translation in a way.
Right. So when the reader is reading it, the reader knows that it is a dialogue taking place in Urdu.
Yeah.
And they should be able to read it in English without becoming alarmed about that. No, this is not Urdu. So they're reading it in English. They know that they know it is Urdu. And to strike that balance, I always found challenging, and it was one of the first things that I noted when I started writing that. This is something that one has to be really careful about.
Yeah. Do you think that your work Translator has informed the thesaurus of Urdu that you're compiling? Because it is a collection of language and its preservation, and it's this really sort of deep and intelligent sense of language and words, and having all of them, gathering them together.
Right. So the thesaurus started as a project to create a good online dictionary, which is not only provides the Urdu meaning but also English translation, just for my own convenience, so that I can have everything in one place, rather than have 20 dictionaries piled up on my table, to make knowledge portable, to make it easy to work between languages. So yes, so that was definitely one of the reasons why I started doing that, and I'm still doing it in different ways, trying to create a kind of dictionary for classics, Urdu language classics. So it becomes easy for future translators to, if they approach a classical text, they know that.
Do you feel like there's growing interest in translation work now? Because I don't think it was very common, but do you feel like people are more interested? Is it getting better? People want to, there's clearly a market for English translations of Urdu literature in English. Do you feel like that's, it's improving, that scene?
Yes, I think if you have a good story, and I always chose stories that I really loved, because it takes a lot of time translating classics. So I always chose stories that I really loved and cared about to translate. And where there is one reader who loves a particular story, there would be others, as was proven. But I'm currently working on a series of smaller qissas, and by small, I don't mean like 10 pages. These are still about 150, 200 pages.
but for a qissa, that's small.
Right, but these are shorter qissas, and some of them, when I first read them, not too long ago, I just, asked myself, how could something so amazing be completely neglected, not even talked about in modern times? So, it's just that. So hopefully next year, I'm planning to have 4 qissas launched over the period, over the year, every 3 months.
That's so exciting. And this is why a translation is so important, because there are all these sort of treasures out there, and if somebody is just not that familiar with the language, and why should we miss out on that? Bilal, do you have any parting advice for aspiring translators?
No, actually. Just,
why?
Yes. I don't know. I mean, what advice can I offer, really, other than what I've already said? I think, just don't consider translations as definitive versions, which I think people setting out to translate would already understand. I imagine, these are interpretations of a very specific person, of a very specific historical moment. And of a very specific experience. And obviously other people will have other interpretations of the same. Obviously one will find difficulty in terms of finding publishers and takers for translation. But I think as, Musharraf's experience, as perhaps my own experience, has shown that if your work is good, if it reads well in the target language, or the output language, I think there will be takers for that. It might not be big presses, but there will be smaller presses who will be interested.
We can all do our bit, sort of putting Urdu back on the map in world literature, because it's just so much out there, and I think it's wonderful, and I'm very excited about all of these possibilities. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the show and sharing your insight about translation and the work that you are doing. Good luck and Godspeed. Thank you guys for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on The Coffee Table. Bye now.